The flames move like living animals, crawling upward, searching for breath, searching for flesh. And in the middle of that rising inferno, a young woman is chained to a wooden post she can't even stand against. Her legs hang uselessly beneath her. Her spine slumps forward. Her shoulders twist at angles no human body was ever meant to hold. The crowd is silent, thousands of faces frozen as the fire begins to touch her broken skin. And yet, she doesn't scream. Not yet. Not at the beginning. Not at the part where most people beg for mercy. She only watches the smoke rise around her like it's the last secret she'll ever learn. Her name is Anne Askew. And the truth you're about to hear, the truth England tried to bury in torture chambers and ash, begins at the end of her life, not the beginning. People will tell you history is written by the victors. But sometimes history is written by the ones who refuse to kneel. Even when their bones have already been destroyed. Even when the men torturing them wear silk robes, not executioner masks. Even when speaking one single name can buy their freedom. And Askew had that chance. She could have walked away from this fire. But she didn't. And to understand why, you have to step into the nightmare she walked into willingly. But before we plunge into that darkness, listen carefully. You're watching the History Veil. And if you want the kind of stories that peel back the polished skin of the past and reveal the bruised bone underneath, then stop for 3 seconds. Hit like, hit subscribe, and hit share. Not for the algorithm, but so the truth doesn't disappear again the way Anne's torturers hoped it would. Now the smoke thickens. The fire grows brighter. And yet our story rewinds, not gently, not like a pleasant memory, but like someone dragging the reel backwards with shaking hands. The crackle of flames fades, replaced by a different kind of sound. A wet tearing noise. A noise only the human body can make when it's being pulled apart. No fire yet. Just ropes. Wood. And the steady grinding of a medieval machine designed to unmake a person one joint at a time. But that scene, her torture, is not where our timeline starts either. No. You need the politics first. The madness. The fear. Because nobody ends up on the rack by accident. Especially not under the rule of a king whose mind could split like thunder one moment and melt into sweetness the next. A king who smelled like infection and rotting flesh. A king whose leg wound leaked so much pus that even his closest advisors pressed spices against their noses to get near him. A king whose moods could kill as easily as disease. Henry VIII ruled England like a storm that refused to pass. And in the last year of his life, that storm reached its darkest point. Henry was dying. Everyone knew it, even if nobody dared say it aloud. His face swollen, his body nearly 400 pounds, his leg a festering pit that doctors drained daily. Pain twisted him. Fear controlled him. And the question that devoured what was left of his mind was simple. Who will rule when I'm gone? His heir, Prince Edward, was brilliant but frail, just 9 years old. Which meant whoever controlled the boy would control the kingdom. And when power becomes a battlefield, truth becomes a weapon. Two armies formed around the dying king. On one side stood the old guard, strict Catholics who believed the Protestant movement was an infection, a sickness that needed burning out of England one heretic at a time. Men like Bishop Gardiner, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, and whose faith smelled more like ambition than devotion. And beside him, Sir Richard Rich, a man whose name history still spits out like something foul. Rich built his career by betraying people smarter, kinder, and more honorable than himself. If you were accused of heresy and Rich walked into your cell, you knew you were already dead. On the other side stood the Reformers, the Protestants, smaller in number, weaker in influence, but burning with dangerous ideas about scripture, faith, and power. And standing with them, in the most dangerous position imaginable, the Queen herself. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth wife. A woman too intelligent for her own safety. A woman who could calm the king's rage with a single sentence. A woman secretly feeding Protestant teachings to her ladies-in-waiting. In private chambers. Behind closed doors. Behind the king's back. If the Catholic faction could prove she was guilty of heresy, they could execute her. Just like Anne Boleyn. Just like dozens of other women whose graves now lay beneath cold stone. But to kill a queen, you need evidence. A name. A witness. A confession. Someone close enough to Catherine, yet vulnerable enough to break. And that is when Gardiner's spies whispered a name. A woman preaching scripture. A woman not afraid to speak. A woman connected to powerful ladies at court. A woman bold enough to challenge priests and brilliant enough to argue scripture in Latin and Greek. A woman whose mind was sharper than the knives her enemies would eventually use to kill her body. Anne Askew, when the watchers reported her connections, Gardiner smiled. They believed she would break easily. They believed she was just a woman. Small, young, unprotected. They believed wrong. But before the chains, before the rack, before the flames at Smithfield, there was a girl in Lincolnshire. Born into minor nobility. Expected to live a quiet life. Expected to marry, bear children, obey, and die without ever being remembered. Except she could read. And not just read, she devoured scripture like someone starved. Before she was 12, she had read the Bible multiple times. Before she was 15, she could argue theology better than most priests. And she refused to believe that bread transformed into flesh during communion. A belief so dangerous in that era that denying it could put you in chains instantly. Her family tried to fix her. They gave her a husband. A Catholic landowner. A man who wanted a silent wife, not a storm in human form. But Anne refused to kneel. Refused to pretend. Refused to swallow doctrine she believed was a lie. And the moment she stood in church and publicly refused the communion host, her husband threw her out like garbage. On the road. Alone. 15 years old. No money. No rights. Most women would have begged to return. Anne didn't. She walked to London. 120 miles. A journey that would reshape England's future. When she arrived, London was already burning, not with fire, but with ideas. And when Protestants discovered a young woman who could quote scripture like a bishop, they listened. They gathered around her. They protected her. They carried her words from house to house. And that circle eventually touched the Queen. That was the mistake. Gardiner moved fast. Anne was arrested the first time in 1545. Interrogated by Bishop Borner, a man infamous for burning people alive. For 5 days he tried to trap her with questions. And parried every attempt with scripture. Calm. Sharp. Unbreakable. She survived. She walked out of the interrogation chamber with her faith intact. And she went right back to preaching. That's when her enemies decided she needed to disappear. Permanently. Her second arrest would not end with release. It would end with rope, wood, and a machine designed to dismantle a human being until nothing remained except obedience or death. But before we reach that room of pulleys and iron wheels, the timeline snaps back one more time, to the fire. The flames rising. The wood cracking. Anne's eyes open, but her body barely holding its shape. Because by the time she reached this stake, her limbs were already dislocated. Her hips torn. Her elbows shattered. Her shoulders pulled free from their sockets. She cannot stand. She cannot walk. They had to carry her to the fire like broken furniture. And yet, even now, she isn't afraid. Because for Anne Askew, fear died long before this fire ever touched her. The first time Anne Askew was arrested, they underestimated her. The second time, they came prepared. On a warm June morning in 1546, heavily armed guards moved through London like wolves cutting through a crowd of sheep. No announcement. No warning. Just a hand on her arm, the cold flash of steel, and the realization that this time, there would be no escape. They brought her to Guildhall, that stone courtroom where the air always smelled of dust and fear, and where truth was less important than the spectacle of obedience. And seated there, draped in authority like armor, was the man who intended to break her. Sir Thomas Wriothesley, Lord Chancellor of England. A man whose face looked carved from iron and whose voice carried the cold certainty of someone who believed laws existed for him, not for the people he used them against. When he questioned Anne, his words were not questions at all. They were traps. Calculated, exact, dripping with the confidence of a man certain she would bend. But Anne did not bend. She answered him with scripture, with calmness, with a clarity that irritated him like a stone under his skin. And the more composed she stayed, the more he began to hate her. Wriothesley leaned forward, hands clasped tightly. "We know you have spoken with the Queen's ladies," he said. His tone was not curious. It was final, like a judge announcing a verdict before hearing the evidence. "Give us the names." Anne met his stare, her voice quiet but steady. "I know none such." He frowned, repeated the question, shifted tactics, threatened, promised, then threatened again. But Anne gave him nothing, not even the smallest thread he could pull. When her calm defiance remained unbroken, Wriothesley's patience began to crack. His cheeks flushed. His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to the guards as if he wanted to drag her to the gallows himself. And that was when he made the decision that changed English history. Take her to the Tower. The words hit the room like the strike of an axe. The Tower of London was not a prison. It was a warning. A place where secrets were ripped out of people one joint at a time. And showed no fear, but the guards around her knew where she was going. They had seen the rack. They had heard the screams. They walked her to the waiting cart as if they were escorting someone already dead. The tower swallowed her with its cold stone teeth. Its iron bars closed behind her like the gates of an enormous animal poised to digest her slowly. But even inside that monstrous place, she walked straight-backed, her eyes steady. She knew this was coming long before they did. The day of the torture dawned grey and heavy, the sky low enough to touch the tower's tallest battlements. They brought her to the torture chamber, 3 floors below ground, where the air was thick and damp, and where shadows clung to the walls like memories that refused to die. And there the rack waited. 7 feet of wood, rope, iron, and hatred built into a single machine. Anne was small, light, almost fragile. Only 25. Her frame looked as though a harsh wind could snap it. And yet in that chamber, she was the only thing that seemed unbreakable. The lieutenant of the tower, Sir Anthony Knevet, stood near the wall, arms crossed tightly over his chest. He knew what was about to happen, and he hated it. But he also knew he didn't have the authority to stop it. Because standing in that room, cloaked in legal power, were the 2 men she had refused to obey, Thomas Wriothesley and Sir Richard Rich. Rich's face held a smile that made even the guards uncomfortable. A thin, sharp smile that never reached his eyes. Wriothesley looked like a man preparing to solve a problem the only way he understood, through force. They removed Anne's outer garments until only a thin shift remained. They tied her wrists to one roller, her ankles to the other, the ropes biting into her skin like teeth. And once everything was secured, Wriothesley approached her one last time, giving her a final chance to break. "Names," he said. "Give us the names." And closed her eyes. Her lips moved silently. A prayer, or maybe a farewell. Wriothesley nodded to the torturer. The first turn of the rack is not painful. Not at first. It's just tension, a tightness across the chest and shoulders, like the body is being asked to stretch where it was never meant to stretch. But that tightness grows, rises, deepens, and then it begins. The torturer turned the wheel another quarter. The ropes tightened. Anne's breath hitched. Her tendons stretched like drawn bowstrings. Her muscles trembled. A sound escaped her, half gasp, half cry. But still, she said nothing. "Give us the names," Wriothesley repeated. She stayed silent. The wheel turned again. The pain was no longer tension. It was the ripping of fibers, the pull of bone from socket, the slow, dreadful separation of joints. And though the room echoed with her cries, her words remained locked behind her teeth. The torturer hesitated. "My lord, I fear I will kill her." Wriothesley's expression hardened. "Continue." But before the torturer could obey, Sir Anthony Knevet stepped forward, voice sharp and loud enough to cut through the chamber's horror. "Stop." The word froze the room. Even Wriothesley looked shocked. The lieutenant of the tower had just directly disobeyed the Lord Chancellor of England. It was treason, punishable by death. "This is illegal," Knevet said, breathing hard. "We have no warrant. And she is a woman. The rack is forbidden." Wriothesley's face turned crimson. "You will obey." "I will not torture without lawful authority." For a moment, Nobody moved. The room felt suspended, like even the air was waiting for the next step. And then Wriothesley did something no one expected. He threw off his velvet robe, rolled up his sleeves, and walked to the wheel. Sir Richard Rich joined him, and two of the most powerful men in England began turning the rack themselves. And scream tore through the chamber like a physical force, echoing up the stairwell, through the floors, into the tower above. Guards stationed 3 stories higher later testified they could hear it. Some said it made them sick. Others claimed they heard her voice from the gardens outside, carried through open windows by the wind, her shoulders dislocated first. A sickening pop, like wood snapping. Then her hips. Then her elbows. Then her knees. The human body is not built to endure this. It is built to break under it. And lost consciousness, they revived her. Asked again, she whispered, "I know nothing." They tortured her again. Hours passed. Hours in which her body was dismantled one piece at a time, but her silence remained intact. Her will stronger than bone. Stronger than law. Stronger than the men who thought pain could buy obedience. And finally, when Sir Anthony Knevet could take no more, he stormed out of the chamber. Straight to the king. Straight to the only man who could stop what was happening below his castle. Henry VIII granted him a full royal pardon before the words had even fully left his mouth. But by the time the royal orders reached the torture chamber, the damage was complete. They carried her back to her cell because she could no longer walk, could no longer sit, could barely breathe without pain. But she had one. And Wriothesley knew it. For long weeks, and Askew lay on the cold stone floor of her tower cell, her body so broken she could not sit up without help. Her arms fell at strange angles. Her hips remained twisted, her joints pulled apart, her bones misaligned in ways no surgeon of her age could have ever repaired. Every breath was a reminder of what was taken from her. And yet, she continued to write. With trembling hands, guided sometimes by other prisoners, sometimes by guards who believed she deserved more mercy than the law allowed, she scribbled her memories onto scraps of paper. Her handwriting small, cramped, pressed hard into the parchment because her fingers could not control the quill gently anymore. Every letter cost pain. Every sentence demanded sacrifice. But she wrote anyway. She wrote about Wriothesley, about Richard Rich, about the rack, about the questions, about her refusal, about the hours of torment they inflicted when they realized she would not serve their agenda. These pages were smuggled out of the tower like stolen treasure, passed from hand to hand among Protestants, copied in secret rooms by candlelight, hidden inside the linings of cloaks, shipped to printers across the channel. What Wriothesley intended as a quiet execution was already blooming into a scandal he could not control. She had become a symbol before she even knew it. But England was not finished with her yet. On July 16, 1546, the guards came for her again. Their footsteps echoed through the stone hallway long before they reached her cell. They carried a wooden chair between them, the kind used not for comfort, but for necessity, because Anne could no longer walk. The rack had taken that from her. They lifted her gently, almost with reverence, almost as if they understood the weight of the injustice they were part of. And they placed her in the chair, securing her fragile body with cloth so she wouldn't fall. The sun outside Smithfield burned white that morning. When the guards carried her into the open air, the crowd fell silent. People had come expecting a condemned heretic, defiant, dangerous, guilty. What they saw instead was a young woman whose body was no longer capable of standing. Her clothes hung loosely on her frame. Her limbs appeared slack, bent at unnatural angles. Chains were wrapped around her waist not as punishment, but because without them, she would collapse. Whispers spread through the crowd like wind rushing through dry grass. What did they do to her? God help us. Is this justice? Even executioners looked away. Near the front stood Thomas Wriothesley, hands folded neatly, face expressionless. Sir Richard Rich stood beside him, eyes darting like a man hoping to avoid recognition. They watched as she was fastened to the stake, her body held upright only by iron and rope. Then the priest stepped forward, holding a scroll sealed with the king's insignia. The words he read out echoed across Smithfield Square, rolling over the silent crowd like a slow-moving storm. His Majesty, King Henry VIII, grants pardon to Mistress Anne Askew, if she will recant her heretical beliefs and return to the authority of Holy Church. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was her chance. Her only chance. A single sentence could end the fire waiting beneath her feet. A few spoken words could return her to life. The priest lifted the scroll toward her. "You need only speak, mistress. Only speak." And looked at him, calm, still, quiet. Her voice, when it came, was soft but strong enough to cut through the stunned silence around her. "I came not hither to deny my lord and master." The priest begged her, pleaded with her. The crowd held its breath. But Anne Askew did not look at the scroll again. For a moment, even the executioners hesitated. Then the order came. The fire was lit. Flames crawled up the wood like hungry fingers. Smoke rose, first in thin strands, then in thick plumes that wrapped around her, lifting her hair gently as if the air itself were mourning. Anne kept her silence. Not a scream. Not a plea. Just the sound of crackling fire and the shuffling of feet. A small pouch strapped to her chest exploded when the flames reached it. Gunpowder, the executioner's crude mercy. It would have ended the suffering instantly for most people. But Anne's body had already endured so much that even this final kindness felt like a whisper compared to what she had survived before. And then she was gone. The crowd did not cheer. There was no triumph. Only the hollow quiet that follows a moment people know they will never forget. But her enemies had one more miscalculation ahead of them. They believed her death would silence her. But death was the last thing they should have feared. Because her writings were already printed. Already being copied. Already crossing borders. Already turning Anne Askew into something far more dangerous than a living woman. A martyr. In London, whispered stories began to circulate. People spoke of how she endured the rack. How two of the most powerful men in England tortured her themselves. How she refused to betray the women closest to the Queen. How her courage undermined an entire conspiracy. And abroad, Protestant leaders seized upon her story like a spark thrown into dry tinder. Sermons were written about her. Woodcuts depicting her final moments were printed and distributed across Europe. Ballads were composed. Her name spread farther than Wriothesley could have ever dreamed. And the conspiracy to destroy Queen Catherine Parr? It died the same moment and refused to speak. Without Anne's confession, the Catholic faction had no evidence. No link. No witness. And when the king learned how far they had gone without permission, he distanced himself from them entirely. Catherine Parr reconciled with Henry. She survived him. She outlived him. She walked away from the danger that consumed countless others. All because one young woman in unbearable pain refused to whisper a name. Time passed. Kings died. Queens ruled. Wars erupted. Religions rose and fractured. Centuries washed over England like waves smoothing jagged stone. But Anne Askew's name remained lodged in history like a splinter that refused to rot away. And here is the final irony. The men who tortured her, the men who tried to bury her story beneath fire and fear, Wriothesley, Rich, and their allies, did succeed at one thing. They became footnotes in her legend. And Askew did not have power, did not have protection, did not have status. But she had her will. And in that cell, in that chamber, in that fire, she proved something that has echoed through time. Power can break your bones, but it cannot break your truth. And that is why her story did not die. Why it traveled centuries to reach you now. Why her voice survived even when her body didn't. If you believe stories like and should never be forgotten, if you believe the darkest truths of history must remain visible, then keep this flame alive. Like this video. Share it. Subscribe to the History Veil. Because every time her story is told, the men who tried to silence her lose again. And Askew died on July 16, 1546. She was 25 years old. And almost 500 years later, her courage still burns brighter than the fire that killed her.